Now, I worked for the NDP when I was a kid, and I had privileged access to the leadership for provincially and federally for reasons that I won't go into, and I thought that many of them were honorable people who were really striving to give the working class a voice. And I believe that the working class needs a voice, a political voice, for obvious reasons. I think the Democrats in the United States have made an absolutely dreadful, abysmal mistake replacing their working class political ethos with identity politics. We're going to talk about that. And I don't think the situation has changed that much. I think one of the things that's happened in the United States is that world stability and peace in some ways has been purchased at the expense of North American working class well-being. You know, because the Chinese have got rich compared to 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. The Indians have got rich, again, same comparison basis. There's more middle-class people in India now than there are in the United States. The trade arrangements that have been in North America allowed for the rise of middle classes globally. At the same time, they opened up the working class in North America to competition from those low-wage sources. And maybe that's a good deal. It's hard to say, right? Because it's not such a bad thing that the Chinese aren't starving, and it's not such a bad thing that the Indians aren't starving, and that those societies are transforming themselves actually into communities that are quite wealthy. It's like, hooray for that. It's an absolutely miraculous transformation. It's the most rapid growth of human wealth in the history of humanity. So we should be pretty happy about that. But we should also remember, at least to some degree, who's paid the price for it. And so, as far as I'm concerned, the working class needs a voice. And it isn't obvious that they have one at the moment. Having said that, however, it isn't obvious to me at all that the people who purport to stand for the working class actually do so, or that if they do so, that the reason they do so is because they're all compassionate and sympathetic and loving and kind and saint-like. I'm more convinced by Orwell's argument. So, back to the NDP. The people I met at the leadership level, a lot of them I had a fair bit of admiration for, but as I worked with the party over about a 5-year period, there was this contradiction that kept emerging for me, and that was that I didn't really like the low-level party functionary activist types. Like, they just weren't personally appealing to me. They seemed peevish and resentful. And then, at the same time, I was going to college. I was about 17. I got elected to sit on the college board of governors, and at that time, Alberta was conservative, politically, right? It still is, of course, but it was part of the progressive conservative empire, because they ruled Alberta forever. And all the board of governor members were basically nominees, right? They were conservative nominees, so these were conservative people. And I was an NDP member, and I thought, and I'd worked for small businessmen too who weren't NDP. They were conservative. I could never figure that out, but I'll tell you about that in a minute. But I had a bad case of cognitive dissonance because it actually turned out that I admired the people on the board of governors. And they were mostly, it was in Grand Prairie, it's not a very big place, and it's not very old. And so if you were reasonably successful in Grand Prairie, the probability that you had inherited your money from the aristocracy was like 0, because there wasn't one, right? The whole damn town was 50 years old. So if you had any influence or wealth, you were a small businessman, small to middle-sized businessman, and you knew what you were doing. And I actually admired these people. I thought, well, that's not very good. I admire them, and I don't share their political views. And then there's these other people with whom I hypothetically share political views, and I don't admire them at all. What's going on? And then I read Road to Whig and Peer, and I thought, oh, that's it. They don't like the poor, they just hate the rich. It's not the same thing. It's not the same set of motivations. And so let's say that you're a postmodernist and you privilege compassion for the oppressed. Think, well, what do you push to the margins? Well, what are you doing with all your hatred and your resentment? And your evil? It's like, you don't have any of that? That's a bad theory. That's a really bad theory. Okay, so fine. So you can say, well, yeah, you can say that, but I don't buy it. I still think that the people who stand to speak for the oppressed are in fact motivated by empathy and sympathy. Their hearts are in the right place. See, I don't really buy that either, because I don't really think, generally speaking, that it's a credible claim for someone to make that their heart is in the right place. Now, you can ask that of yourself, and if you think your heart is in the right place, well, more power to you. You know, I can't see the halo from here, however. And so, given that you're just as malevolent as your neighbor, or maybe even more so, and that that's actually pretty malevolent given the intrinsic nature of human beings, I can't help but wonder what you're doing with all those traits that you're not admitting to. But you could even object, well, you know, that's a pretty pessimistic view of humankind. It's not, by the way. It's just not naive. But anyways, you could object that, and you could say, no, actually, the weight of moral authority is, in fact, on the left, even the radical left, with those who identify with the oppressed and who are working to better their conditions. Fair enough. So then let's say, well, let's give those people some power. And if they're actually motivated by compassion and empathy and desire for the working class, if you give them power and you give their ideas power, then as those ideas unfold in real time, you're going to find out, like, do things get better for the working class, let's say, or do they get worse? Because we could consider that like an experiment. We could consider the outcome proof. I don't know what else you would do. I don't know how else you would come to your decision, because it's just theory till you see it happen. Now, Nietzsche said back in the late 1800s that after he said that God was dead, and I suppose that would also mean the theory of suffering that I outlined at the beginning, that is at the basis of Judeo-Christian civilization, that God was dead and that people had killed him and that we'd never find enough water to wash away the blood. It's a paraphrase, but I've got the basic message right. And he also said there'll be two consequences of that: nihilism, because there's no transcendent meaning, and a move to totalitarianism, because people can't tolerate nihilism. And he said the most likely pathway to totalitarianism would be communism, essentially. He didn't quite use those words, but he meant that. The words are close enough. He said socialism, but I'm going to use communism to distinguish it from democratic socialism. And he said that probably tens of millions of people would die in the 20th century as we played out that experiment. And then he said, but it might be worth it if we learn something from it. Rough, man. I mean, and unbelievable. Like, I cannot figure out how in the world he knew that that was going to happen, especially so far in advance. But Dostoevsky knew the same thing. He wrote this book called The Devils, or The Possessed. You could read that. That's a great book. It takes about 150 pages to get going. But once like everything snaps together after that, you know, and then it moves. And it's basically his prophecy about, it's an examination of the kind of person who had arisen in the aftermath of the death of God in Russia, who would lead the communist revolution. That's essentially it. It's brilliant. It's terrifying. And it's a great intro to Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which describes what did happen when those sort of people took over the revolution.